Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to show you how I attempted to make these two end-grain cutting boards out of some southern yellow pine. Now I just got done building two pretty big projects in a row, so I wanted to tackle something a little bit smaller before I head into my next big project. So I'm going to show you how I put together these end-grain cutting boards. I'll show you everything that went right and everything that went wrong. Let's get into the video. To get started on these cutting boards, I needed to work on milling up this southern yellow pine. Now I feel like pine is not really the most sought after wood to use when it comes to cutting boards, but I've seen how some of these end grain pine boards have turned out, and I think they're pretty neat. Now these boards were actually given to me by my brother-in-law, and they had a few nails that had to be removed first. Once I got those nails out, I could start figuring out how many cutting boards I might be able to get out of this stuff. I decided that I would aim for making 2 cutting boards from this pine. Then I took them over to the miter saw and cut them down to size. Now I left them a little longer than I wanted, and I'll come back later and trim them to their exact size. And as you can see, that end grain pattern is what is going to make these cutting boards unique. Then I took my pieces and started working on milling them to the thickness I was after. I ran them through the jointer several times and then took them over to the planer to achieve that desired thickness. With my boards mostly milled up, I took them back over to the miter saw to square off the edges. Then it was over to the table saw. Now since this is going to be an end grain cutting board, the width that I cut my pieces on the table saw to is going to determine the overall thickness of my cutting board. So for my first cutting board, I ended up cutting strips that were about 1.5 inches wide, and then for the other board, I cut 3/4 inch wide strips. I basically just ripped down a bunch of these strips out of my milled lumber until I felt like I had enough to make 2 decent sized cutting boards out of. Then I took those strips that I ripped over to the miter saw and I started cutting them into 2-inch long blocks. Now I feel like there's probably a better way to do this than using the miter saw, but in the moment that's what I decided to use. But to be honest, it felt a little too dangerous for that many small repeated cuts. Whenever I had a piece that was too close to the blade, I would use a push stick to hold it, but small pieces still want to fly on you when cutting them on the miter saw. So again, I'm sure there is a better and safer way to make these small cuts, and if you know of any, please let me know in the comments so that I can be sure to implement that the next time. I would actually appreciate any feedback. And after making all those cuts, I was left with a ton of wooden blocks that I had to sort through. Now here's the beauty of this style cutting board in my opinion. You can get as wild as you want in terms of the design because that end grain is not going to match up perfectly no matter how much you try. So I think the beauty is in the craziness of it. We can all be a little crazy looking but still beautiful, right? Asking for a friend. So what I did was just play around with those wooden blocks to find a pattern that I thought looked groovy enough for me, and I sort of laid it out piece by piece, trying to reverse those grain patterns in a lot of different ways. Once I felt like I had a general layout established, I started working on gluing it all together. Now, these types of glue ups are never the easiest in my opinion, but how I decided to tackle it was by using some straight edges that I could sort of push everything against and try to keep it square. Then I just put wood glue on all the pieces and clamped it all together. Once my boards had dried overnight, I squared up the edges. Then I decided to add a chamfer to the bottom of the larger board. To do this, I set my table saw to 45 degrees and I set my fence so that I could run the board through and get a chamfer on each side. Now, it's all a personal preference, but I did feel like I set my fence over a little too far and my chamfer was a little too aggressive for my taste, but hey, I can live with it. I then used my router to round over all the edges. I went with an 1/8 inch round over for the larger board and a 1 1/4 inch round over on both sides of the smaller board. Then came the most fun part of any cutting board build, all of the sanding. That was clearly a joke because, well, if you've made any cutting boards in your lifetime, well, you know that that is most definitely the worst part. But it's got to be done, so I made my way through each of the grits until they were feeling smooth. Then I did a little water popping to really raise that grain. And because I'm too impatient to let it air dry, I broke out the heat gun to speed up the process so that I could get back to my favorite activity again. Yep, you guessed it, more sanding. After I was done sanding, I cleaned the boards up pretty good, and then I got them ready for some finish. Now, one of the best parts about making cutting boards, in my opinion, is just how easy they are to finish. All you have to do really is apply some mineral oil and maybe some wax, and they are good to go. The mineral oil I used was this combo of mineral oil and beeswax. Now, I've been working my way through this stuff, and before I buy any other type to try, I wanted to finish this up. But I'm just about out, so let me know in the comments what your favorite type of oil to use for cutting boards is, and then I might just have to check it out before I buy some new stuff.
All right, so as you guys can see, I have my boards oiled up here, and there's a lot going on here, some good, some bad. Let's start with the good first. So I'm really digging the way this grain pattern really pops when I put the oil on it. I love the different variations, the crazy design. It has a really funky look that I really love, and I think that's what drew me into making this style cutting board to start with. So now let's talk about the bad. As you can see, I have a lot of this discoloration here that maybe it's a personal preference, but to me, it really draws my eye away from the overall design. To be fair, when I started working with this wood, and this is the first time I've ever worked with this wood before, so I didn't really know. But when I started working with this wood, this discoloration here was a very light blue color, so it really wasn't that bad. So I didn't think that when I put oil on it, I should have known, but I didn't think when I put the oil on it, it was gonna really darken this much. I could have done a trial to see kind of what it would look like, and I didn't do that, so lesson learned. But now I'm not an expert on what exactly this discoloration is, but I did consult Google, and basically from what I found, I think it's a sort of fungus that gets into the wood when it's freshly sawn and gives it that kind of discoloration. So like I said, I think that's probably what it is. I'm not 100% sure. If you happen to know exactly what it is, or you've worked with something like this before, leave a comment below and let me know. But given that, if this is a fungus, since these were going to be cutting boards, I don't know, just the idea of food and fungus really blows my mind, and I don't think I want to pair those two together, so I'm probably not going to use these as cutting boards after all. They'll be more of a decoration piece, more of just a trial for the next cutting board like this I might make. And if I do make another one like this, I would probably try to find pieces that didn't have this discoloration in it. It would have been a little hard with the wood that I had because, as you can see, almost every piece has a little bit of that discoloration in it, and so it would have been difficult for this wood, but I think in the future I would look for pieces that didn't have that in. But for the purposes of a cutting board, like I said, I'm not sure that I would want to mix this if this is fungus and food. It could be totally fine, I don't know, but I'm not going to risk it. So like I said, probably just going to use these as decoration pieces more than anything. So we're not going to call this a fail, we're going to call this a lesson learned. So all in all though, I still think these things turned out pretty awesome, and if you were going to make one like this, like I said, personal preference, but you could sort of use similar design and then use some wood that had some really cool grain patterns, because this end grain cutting board I think really gives you the option to really switch up that design and kind of make it unique and make it whatever you want. So all in all, pretty cool. All right guys, so that was my experience making this end grain cutting board out of some southern yellow pine. Now, I still think this thing is really cool. I mean, I'm not just gonna go throw this thing away because it didn't turn out exactly like I'd planned. There's a lot of things to be learned from this build, and I definitely plan on making this again in the future. And like I said before, not everything that you make has to be the best thing ever. Sometimes the whole point is just to get out there and build something and be creative. And if nothing else, I hope this video inspired you to do that. Hey, thanks so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to subscribe to my channel for future videos. And with that said, I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.